from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I welcome you to part 2 of a 6-week series entitled People's Law School. On today's program, the specific area of discussion will be domestic violence, and we'll be back with you for 4 more weeks on other issues of the law. I want to particularly thank the Conflict Resolution Center of the Inland Northwest Incorporated for putting this series together, as well as a 9-week course at North Idaho College. I also wish to express our appreciation to the Community Education Department at North Idaho College, as well as the First District Bar Association of Idaho and the Kootenai County Bar Group. We've also received sponsorship from the Coeur d'Alene Press and the Spokesman Review for this series, and we're grateful to all those organizations. On today's program, I'm pleased to welcome 3 guests who are most capable of speaking to this very important and serious subject. First of all, I welcome to the program Holiday Sanderson, who is the Executive Director of the Coeur d'Alene Women's Center Incorporated, and next to her is Dick Halligan, who is with the Post Falls, Idaho Police Department. He's a lieutenant in charge of investigations. And next to him is our 3rd guest, Sue Flamia, who is an attorney in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and she's also the president of the Conflict Resolution Center's Board of Directors. And Sue is with another attorney, Alan Wasserman, really responsible for all of this coming together, and we thank you very much. As we enter our program today, I'm, as always, pleased to welcome our panel. First of all is Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Janelle Burke to commence today's questioning.
This is an issue that's received a great deal of attention nationally and locally. Holiday, my first question will be directed to you. What exactly is the extent of this problem nationally? Can you give us some statistics?
Yes. Domestic violence is the #1 cause for placing women in emergency rooms. It's higher than muggings, rapes, and automobile accidents combined. Women are 9 times more danger being in their homes than in the streets. There are, if women try to leave from a domestic violence situation, greater risk from violence than if they were to stay in that situation. And they don't have places to go to, because we have 1,200 shelters for domestic violence in this country, but we have to put that in perspective. We also have about 3,200 animal shelters in this country, so they don't have a place to head once they leave.
So it's an issue that is very deserving of a lot of attention.
Right.
Because
it touches so many different areas. 50% of the homeless people in this country are victims of domestic violence who are trying to get out. Women and children who need a place to stay.
Well, we've talked a bit about this national scene, but Dick, can you tell us something about what's happening at the local scene? What is it like to be an officer who's responding to a domestic violence call?
Well, based upon my experience in education and training in that, and talking obviously with numerous other officers, I would find it as one of the most explosive situations that you could be handling. You take a look at it as the officer responding to a domestic violence in a person's home, and per se, that's their home. And then you're coming in being a party not associated with that home, and having to, in some cases, act as a referee or try to determine what's happened in that home. And in some cases, you may take a party out of that home. So it can get very violent very quickly, and the officers have to be very alert when they handle these types of situations.
Now, I understand that your department, Post Falls, has a model program. Can you explain to our viewers what that is about?
Yes, it was implicated in December of 1993. It's a victim advocates program. We kind of refer to it as OASIS, which stands for Officers Advocate Sharing Intervention Services. We have an employee, her name is Sue Smith. She has a degree in social work. She is a full-time, 40-hour plus employee, and her main function is to handle domestic violence situations. She also becomes involved in child abuse, whether it be sexual or physical, and juvenile runaway type incidents. She actually, what is actually great, she actually responds directly to the scene of the domestic violence, whether it be 3 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She's on call 24 hours a day, and right now there's just herself, so she does put in quite a number of hours, and this program has just completely exploded. We're starting to get inquiries from numerous other agencies who are interested in the program. We're able to set up a shelter home in the city of Post Falls that we use to house in emergency situations. And I guess the biggest factor is that Sue can get to the scene directly after the scene has been secured by the patrol officers. And then she basically takes it from that point on as far as talking with the abused party or parties and directing them and helping them in any way she possibly can to get out of that situation.
One other question that I have for you is we oftentimes think that abuse occurs around certain events. Is that true? The full moon, the holiday season, whatever that might be?
Well, to be real honest with you, as my experience as a police officer, I found there has been more problems during full moon. Not necessarily saying that's the cause of it.
But holiday seasons probably
yes,
also
because you have a mixture of
create
families.
stress.
Some get along, some don't, but they all get together because of the holiday season or whatever it may be, and at times tempers flares.
Steve Sheen.
Dick, I'm going to follow up on that real quickly. We talked just a little bit before the show about the alcohol and drugs as a factor. Do you see that linked with many of your domestic violence calls? Has somebody been drinking?
Yes,
or
I do.
Using drugs?
Yes, I do.
And I would assume that just raised the danger factor for everybody involved, the people who are abused and your officers, dramatically when that's the case?
That's correct.
Sue, I wonder if you could take a minute for us. We really haven't even defined domestic violence, and I guess most of us think of physical violence, but there are other forms of abuse as well, I guess. Could you share some of that with us?
Yes, Steve. There is also psychological abuse, but now if we want to talk about the technical definition of domestic violence that we have in Idaho, we're talking about threats or actual sexual abuse, physical abuse, imprisonment, holding one against his or her will. And that's the definition, and it has to be by family members or individuals related by blood or marriage, people who have a child in common or who have shared a home together. So that covers that, and it's broad to some extent, but there are still cases that are not qualifying, but there's still violence. We're seeing an increase in violence with young high school couples, and they are not qualifying for these protections that the court can have.
And if I can have just one more question, sort of a toss-up for the panel. Holiday already told us how big a problem domestic violence is. I'm curious as to whether the courts and the legal system, general public's attitude toward domestic violence as a problem has changed. Was it ever the kind of thing, well, that's in the family, we leave that alone? Is it now becoming more of a priority in the legal system?
People have asked us, why have we had more calls, why have there been more reports? And I get asked that quite often in interviews, and my answer is usually that it's a combination of two factors in this area particularly, because we've had an increase in population, but I think we've also had an increase in awareness of the legal resources that people can turn to. They know they can call the courts, they know they can file a protection order, they know that the shelters exist in Post Falls and in Coeur d'Alene, and they know that there's some place they can go to explore their options and figure out what they can do.
And these options weren't available years ago. There's some tools that the legislature has given us as law enforcement in the laws, the wording of the laws that help us to try to deter future domestic violence or stop it in the home, pertaining like to a misdemeanor, which is domestic battery is a misdemeanor. And as most law enforcement know, in order to arrest on a misdemeanor, a police officer has to see it. And a lot of times we're just not there. But the laws have been worded as to now, based upon the officer's investigation, his probable cause, physical evidence, statements at the scene, he is able to make an arrest at that time without actually observing the actual incident take place. This is a big tool for us.
And the laws have been on the books since
In
1989.
1989.
So there were no tools before that.
I'd like to move away from the local issues because our viewers are in many states. And I'd like to talk again on the national level because this is a national or even international problem. It happens many places. And in some other countries, what has happened to women in particular, even death without prosecution in some countries. But the book that has been created for this course on the People's Law School, I went through it, and there was another thing in there that I think could be helpful to people in various states that are listening to this program are the signs of a batterer. And I know the book indicated there were 12. And I don't know, Holiday, where you want to take this question, or Sue, but could you share with our viewers, for people who are in these difficult situations and they're trying to decide what to do, and as you indicated, Holiday, it's really disturbing how many people who actually leave these domestic violence scenes that are even killed by the spouse for leaving. But also by staying, there are certain things that go on that the batterer tries to convince them to do, or excuses. So would you share that with the viewers?
Well, we get a lot of women who come to the Women's Center who aren't totally convinced that they're married to a batterer. And we hand them these cards that have the list of 12 things on them. It just starts off with jealousy. And
if I could interrupt, I know you
right.
will feel it. Are there some of these that appear more often than others? Is jealousy the most common one?
Jealousy is very common because they don't want, if we're speaking of the men who are 95% of the batterers, women are 95% of the victims nationally, and given the statistics that we have. So I'm going to use the genders in that terminology. Batterers don't want their victims to be seen with other men, and if they even speak at work, that's an enormous trigger for them to get angry with their intimate partner. They blame everything else for the domestic violence. Domestic violence is an issue of power and control, the use of intimidation and physical violence and fear to exert power and control, but it's never the batterer's fault. The batterer always says, it was a rotten day at work, you didn't, warm the peas, you didn't let the cat out. They can find any excuse. It's your fault. And so they use a lot of degradation and telling the victim that the victim is not good enough. So a victim is going to begin to lose their sense of self-esteem over the years because they're going to believe what the batterers told them. And at the end of a domestic violence incident, they start moving into what we call the honeymoon phase, and they say, oh, I'll never do it again. And so many of the victims we work with have heard that over and over and over again, and he really doesn't mean to, and they want to make it better. What they really want is for the violence to stop. They don't necessarily want to get out of the intimate relationship because they love the partner. They just want the violence to stop.
One of the things that I've heard too in former programs we've done is that by being bombarded this way for a long period of time, that the victim often, do they not, become totally convinced that they did something that caused the violence. And they keep trying to look at themselves as if they correct certain things that the violence will end. And isn't that a problem that you have?
Absolutely, because our society acculturates a woman to believe that she's the responsible one, she's the one who nurtures. So her responsibility is to keep that home life sound. And a batterer with that, the male views that the woman's place is to take care of the home, then constantly tells her, it's your fault, you're not taking care of things. You have to take care of things here, and if you did it better, if you were a better wife, if you were a better mother, over and over and over again, starting off with little incidents like pushing, shoving, throwing things, and building up to the violent incident where her jaw might be broken. She's heard it so many times, it's almost like being brainwashed, that she really begins to believe that she's responsible for it and not him.
And then it's hard to deal with.
That's right.
And Tony, I wanted to just go on with the topic about these batterers. We start out with small things, small physical. There'll be the psychological, the name calling, belittling, and so on. We have that going on, and then we move into the little shove, or the little poke, or the little a light hit. But each time these physical interactions escalate, and so before you know it, you are into the tremendous battering that goes on, and ultimately these women are at grave danger of death.
Yes. And can I ask this one more question? I'll come back to you, Dick. We've talked about the spouse being abused. Let's talk about children for a minute. I know you're very involved and concerned about children. The batterer that attacks children, what kind of unacceptable excuses do they use in beating the children? Is the profile similar to the spouse, or what do we find when we try to treat the perpetrator?
Tony, what we're seeing is that violence spills over against the children, and we have the protection orders in place so that the courts have the ability to protect the victim's spouse. It also has the power to protect these children. Now, some of this, if it's a bruised child, broken bones and so on, you know that the state will step in and file a protection action for the child. So it's lesser violence than that. But the fighting continues and continues and continues, and the batterers are often very manipulative. And what we're not having at this time is enough protection of these children who are products of these violent homes, and it has tremendous negative impact to them. And we are working on that now, so that we're asking the courts for appointments of guardian ad litem to protect the children. We're asking for supervised visitation. We're asking for neutral transfers of children, things to get the children out of the middle of these fights.
But Dick, you have to deal with it on a very personal basis, and I know you have so much you want to say, but when you are talking, or your staff is talking with the batterer, what do they say? What reasons do they give for battering children? Is it the same as spouses? That's a direct question I wanted to get to.
What a batterer uses for battering the children, there again you have jealousy. The mother or the spouse spends more time with the children, is more attentive to the children. Her main concern is the children. There's jealousy there, whether they would admit it or not, there is. You find that they use that as a tool to get back at the other person. The children are the weaker, and therefore they feel they can overpower them and show their authority to the children.
Yeah. Janelle Burke.
We have a variety of laws now that are in place to protect people. And I think probably in most of our neighboring jurisdictions, as well as in Idaho, there's some sort of a domestic violence order that can be entered in order to protect people. But we also now are having stalking laws that are coming into effect. Can we talk just for a minute about stalking? And my first question will be to Dick. Have you experienced that in your work, and is that a real thing that goes on out there in the world?
Yes, it is, and I have experienced it. And for many years we did not have that law to assist us with that. Now we do. And it's a good law, and it helps us as law enforcement to protect the battered party.
How do you define stalking, I guess? I'm not talking about the legal terminology as much as just how do you define it? How do people recognize stalking?
Basically, I could give you an example. You have a boyfriend, girlfriend, or say even not a boyfriend, girlfriend, but you have a party who becomes fascinated with another party, whether they know each other or not, and that party proceeds to follow, harass, or phone call, write letters, and this is a continuous thing. And or just set out in front of their house and watch them, set out in front of their work and watch them, where actually legally, supposedly before, they weren't doing anything wrong. But now with the stalking laws, we can act on this, and we do act on this.
In terms of the domestic violence that goes on, Holiday, can you talk a little bit about how women's centers generally help victims to find their way through the system?
Women's centers offer advocacy and shelter. Many centers have safe homes, and there are, I think, 9 fully staffed shelters, I think, in the state of Idaho. And we have a network through the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence to other shelters throughout the country, you know, for assisting women to escape Idaho, escape wherever they came from. It's kind of almost like an underground railroad to get them someplace safe. If a woman comes in to us and doesn't need shelter, she quite often needs assistance filling out a protection order. We have court advocates who assist with the protection orders, help them focus their thoughts and get to the point so that the judge can see exactly what are the legal definitions being fulfilled in the acts of violence or threats of violence against her. The advocates also accompany the victims to the court so they don't have to face a new situation completely on their own. They offer support. They don't speak for them in court, but they're like that moral support, standing next to them. You let them know that there's somebody there finally that believes their story. When they get permanent protection orders, that's the first time they might have to face the batterer again, because the batterer has to have under due process has to have an opportunity to speak back and say, this is my view of the situation. And that might be the first time in a while that the woman has had to face the batterer, and our advocates go to court with them to assist them through that situation. Our advocates are generally, they follow the cases with the same victim as much as they can through whatever process. Some of our advocates have followed cases for 5 years as they've settled on custody issues, different levels of protection orders, all kinds of things.
And Sue, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between the protection order and what may be going on in court in an action, an actual divorce action, et cetera, how this moves into play together?
Thanks, Janelle. The protection order is to keep the parties apart. And one of the really good things about a protection order is it goes into the police computers, and so the police respond as quickly as they can. So we have that aspect, just keeping peace, and that is peace for husband, wife, and peace for the children to some extent, as much as possible. Then the divorce action is filed, and the court will go ahead with the division of the property, the determination of where the children should be. And again, violence, whether it's in front of the child or not, is one of the factors the court must consider in determining where children are to be placed and the amount of time the children will have with each parent. And then the court also does the other aspects of the divorce, which include payment of debt, payment of child support, whether or not there will be spousal support, division of property. So you can have the two actions going on at the same time. But the main thing with the protection order is to keep the peace, keep people safe.
Steve Sheen.
Here's a question for anyone in the group who cares to respond, and I don't mean to suggest that we shouldn't try to work these problems out and teach people how to live together peacefully, but how often does that happen? If someone has a history of spousal or child abuse, how often does counseling and police intervention, whatever else you can bring to bear, work? And how often are they going to just repeat that activity?
We have an estimate at the shelter that a woman will return to her batterer 5 to 7 times. And the reasons for that aren't because we're not doing our job. The reasons are that they don't have the resources in society to go to. If a woman leaves her batterer, she has to have something to go to. One police chief in the area told me that he felt like in 75% of the cases that he'd seen, the reason that the women that he worked with went back was for financial reasons. They couldn't economically survive with their children if they left that situation. There's some hard choices that these women have to make in leaving their batterers.
Do you see a lot of repeat calls?
Yes, we do, and I was going to mention that a lot of officers get frustrated because they don't understand why they go to this house 10 times in 1 month and they find the same person there. But now with education to the community, as well as the police officers, and as well to the victims, officers are learning. There's a reason why, and so they're learning to work beyond their first observation. And why is she back here again? Why is he back here again? What a lot of people don't understand is they look at domestic violence as physical, all the time physical. That's not necessarily true. You can have psychological, mental abuse for years, and that's hard to tell. That's hard to tell to a police officer that walks in, and his job is to try to find physical evidence, gather facts, and there are none. So it's hard to describe to a police officer or anybody that you've been mentally abused for X amount of years.
I asked a question about an individual repeating that offense. There's another side to that question, and that's the way violent behavior is passed from generation to generation. I know that child sex offenders are often victims of sexual abuse as children. Is there that same link for spousal abuse and child abuse, physical violent abuse too?
Absolutely.
Yes.
They grow up seeing the violence. They feel that the violent behavior is the way to solve situations. And our job as a community is to find ways to intervene in there and break that cycle of violence so they're not learning that that's the only way to resolve a conflict.
And Steve, the batterers treatment counselors are telling us that it takes a minimum of 1 year of intense counseling with the batterer before that behavior changes, and often as much as up to 3 years. And I think that is meeting, is it once a week, Holiday, or is
That's
it?
meeting once a week
Once
with a
a
group
week?
for 6 months, and once a week, once a month after the first 6 months, after you've passed a certain level and the counselor approves you to go on.
And I assume that a lot of people won't go that long. They think that they have gotten enough information, they go right back into the situation.
Yes,
Right,
yes.
right.
Sue, I have a question for you. This is a really troubling one. We've had a lot of really well-known cases around the United States that ended in the violence of death of a spouse. And in many of those cases, there's on record with the police and the courts that there was a restraining order. And the police have been to the home 18 or 20 times. In other words, the spouse has gone illegally to the home. And yet the police go and try. And my question is, it ends in the end in death. Even though there's been this pattern of violating the restraining order, are restraining orders adequate in this country, or what can we do to make sure that when the restraining order is violated, that this pattern doesn't continue until there's a tragedy of death?
Tony, I think the restraining orders are a very big step forward. What we need to do is to follow up, and there are model programs in San Diego, Duluth, and Quincy, Massachusetts, and they find that as soon as the first violation of that protection order occurs, the violator is prosecuted. And what they have seen is a tremendous decline in the number of deaths in domestic violence cases.
So I really hear you saying that one of the problems is in some localities there's just simply not been enough enforcement by the courts of the restraining order when it's violated.
That's correct.
You need tougher sentencing.
Right. I agree.
Janelle Bird,
Well, we're very close to being out of time.
like 1
but
minute.
One question that I have is, with regard to women who are battered, does it happen more often when there are children in the home?
Yes or no?
No.
I wouldn't.
On
I'd
that
say
note,
no.
I have to bring this to a conclusion. I have to interrupt. We're out of time, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank our guests for being with us today. I know the panel joins me in that, and I'd like to invite you to be with us again next week when we'll do the third week in the 6-week series called People's Law School, or Know the Law, and we'll move to another area of law. And I really hope this is helpful to you as you deal with life day to day. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.